We've got a real big problem making replicas of historical swords. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, many of you will know if you follow the Facebook page, link below, that I was in the Royal Armouries 2 days ago. I'm working on the second batch of the Royal Armouries Windlass Matt Easton collaboration. So we did the first batch last year, went great, was well received, some constructive feedback which we've completely taken on board, but it's all gone very well. So we're looking at the second batch now, different types of swords. Very exciting, also quite challenging, more about that in the future. But for me, it's really highlighted a major issue we've got when replicating historical swords. And that fundamentally is that what some of the modern audience want is not necessarily compatible with replicating historical swords. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, quite simply, I have covered this to some degree in previous videos, but essentially the modern audience often wants a modern item. They don't actually want a replica of the historical item. Quite simply, a modern item is expected to be completely perfect and symmetrical and straight in all ways, and the originals aren't. Now we're going to look at some originals here and some replicas as illustrations of this fact. So there are a few things which have come up in reviews online, and there's a certain degree of what I would describe as fetishization of certain characteristics of replica swords. We talked about rippling in the blade, which is an artifact of essentially polishing and grinding usually. Can also be connected to varying degrees to how the blade was forged, or if it was forged. But also there's the fitment of the parts, the hilt parts for example, to the tang. So the fitment of the pommel and the guard, sometimes the grip, and there's also the subject of symmetry. So I'm going to pick up a wonderful sword, which is the Albion Lancaster, one of my favourite replica swords that I own. I absolutely love it, no criticism here whatsoever. But this is kind of perfect, and it's very difficult to find medieval originals that are as perfect as this, both in terms of the flatness of the finish, in terms of the fitment of the blade into the guard, the straightness of the pommel, the symmetry of the guard, all of these sorts of things. Now, when I was working on the first batch of windlass Royal Armouries swords, so I grab one here, there we go, and there's one of the long swords. I was actually fairly lucky because there were certain things which I didn't need to think about changing because they were already pretty well dialed in, although the replicas in some regards are more perfect than the originals. So some examples: the turn-ups on the end of the quillons here, they're not exactly the same on each end on the original swords usually. But we made them perfect, we made them symmetrical, or pretty close to perfectly symmetrical, because we know that's what the market wants. Equally, the length and thickness and taper of the quillons. These are hand-forged items on the original swords. On the replicas, we endeavour to make them equal on both branch, both quillon of the guard. The originals often aren't, and I was taking some detailed measurements the other day, and I had to make some interpretative choices because the quillons were not equal on both sides. They were roughly equal length, not exactly the same length, but one was slightly thicker than the other one. Do we replicate that, or do we make them completely symmetrical? The other question is the fitment of the blade into the guard. Now this has become something which has become fetishized. It has become a massive point of, is this a good sword or is this not such a good sword? Is it worth the money? And people look at that and go, how well fitted is the blade into the guard? The problem is, one of the swords that I was working with the other day, a beautifully made and historically important sword that I'm sure people are going to love when the replica comes out, has a massive hole. The hole in the guard doesn't even vaguely fit the shape or size of the blade. It's a massive, great gaping hole, and it was obviously held in place by the pressure of the grip, possibly even filler. I know from looking at swords and daggers in the Museum of London that some of them actually fill up that gap, a bit like an Indian sword, with certain types of pitch glue. They literally just fill the hole with filler. So the metal part fits against the metal part, is held in place by the wooden grip essentially, and then to keep it all tight and make no gaps, they literally make some type of glue filler to fill in there. A bit like cutler's resin, how some knives are still made. Also the fitment of the pommel to the tang. Now first of all, the hole where the tang goes into the pommel, on the originals often the hole for that is way bigger than the tang, and there's a big open question, well, and it's jangling around and loose. Why is it like that? Well, quite simply, on the originals often the wooden grip, probably maybe they used filler again, maybe the wooden grip interacted in some way so it plugged onto the wooden grip, and the wooden grips are usually gone, are lost due to archaeological processes. So very often the hole into the pommel is bigger, and even when the pommel is fixed, there are other issues. So one of the swords I was measuring the other day, the pommel was not symmetrical. It projected more on one side than the other, despite the fact it was fundamentally a wheel pommel, and it was a bit twisted as well. Now I know people like Roland Vorcheka have theories about the twist of pommels and ergonomics, but the problem is you find pommels twisted in both ways, random ways, and also straight and also asymmetrical, and sometimes they're perfect or very close to perfectly symmetrical. So very often pommels are not symmetrical and have random features to them. So this is a real problem. When we're replicating something, do we take the fundamental measurements of the original medieval or Renaissance object and make them symmetrical for the modern market, or do we keep all of the asymmetry? And some of the asymmetry might not be intentional, some of it might be accidental, some of it might even be archaeological, like the pommel issue I talked about. A lot of these pommels which have a twist on them, you can physically move the pommels on the tang because they're not tightly attached to the tang still. So that's problematic. How do we know what angle the original slightly skewed pommel, if it was slightly skewed, was, or was it straight and it's just gone skewed because of archaeological processes? So it's very, very problematic reproducing these. Another issue is the lines along the blade. So this would be something that would be made a big thing of with Japanese swords, for example, and I'll get to Japanese swords in a second. But looking along the blade, when people do sword reviews, they often talk about the geometry of the edge. That's fair enough, the straightness of the edge, the straightness of the fuller or midrib that goes up the centre, the sort of middle, the spine of the blade. And also the bevels and the flats, you know, how flat are they? How much rippling is there? Do any of the lines meander? The problem is the originals, and bear in mind that I've handled and documented swords, including swords that belonged to kings and emperors, including Emperor Maximilian and people like that. Many of them are asymmetrical. The fullers are not always perfectly straight, they're often wobbly. The groove, the surfaces are often wobbly. The edges sometimes are wobbly due to honing, and that's the other thing we have to bear in mind, is that wear and tear on the sword is there and you can measure it, but it's not necessarily how it was originally made. And certainly rippling. Now I've talked about rippling before. Now here I've got a very nice sword made by Paul Binns, and this is a Anglo-Saxon style sword of the 10th century, 900s, and this does have rippling on it, but not very much. It's well done, and it's comparable with originals. So some random swords here. I'm not going to get it off the wall, but you can see I've got a 17th century rapier there that has some rippling in the blade. I've looked at 18th century backswords, they have rippling in the blades. 19th century sabres, they have some degree of rippling in the blades usually. It's a product of usually using wheels for grinding and buffing. Here I've got a silver mounted, an ebony, high quality, probably French hunting sword. It needs some cleaning up. It's in my stock inventory at the moment, so it needs a bit of cleaning. Looking along the blade, and indeed it has some very light rippling in the blade. Even Japanese swords, and here I have a Japanese wakizashi which has Edo fittings but an earlier 17th century blade, and looking along it, it's very, very flat. Now Japanese swords, and I think this is often where the rippling perception comes from in online sword reviews, it comes from Japanese blade reviews, and it is very, very flat, but it does have a little bit of rippling in it. And indeed I've got another 17th century Kanbun period katana behind me there. That has it, I've checked that earlier, that has a little bit of rippling in it. And sometimes the lines that we see on Japanese blades, they meander a bit. They're not absolutely perfect. It's not like they were made by robots. They were made by hand. These were hand forged, hand polished, and sometimes multiply, polished over the course of a long period of time. So there are imperfections. There's asymmetry, there's lines that wobble, there's surfaces that wobble a little bit, there's use, so if an edge gets damaged and has to be the geometry has to be fixed, sometimes you'll get a slight meander in the edge there. The guards are often asymmetrical and not always straight. They don't always fit that snugly to the blade. The pommels can be all over the place. So, where does this land us? Here's a problem. Some people want a perfect, geometrically ideal sword that if you had a mirror in the middle it would be exactly the same on either side. Very few of the originals, certainly from medieval and Renaissance Europe, are like that. Okay, so do you want a replica? Do you want a pure replica that has all of the imperfections? Do you want a replica that's slightly blended down so it's got more symmetry than perhaps the original has? Or it's more like it was when it was originally made, which isn't necessarily how it is now due to the conditions it's survived through? Or do you want something that's essentially an impression of the original object but made perfect for the modern market? And those are different things. So when you come to review and view swords and when you get a sword in the post, what do you want, and therefore what type of maker, what kind of company do you go to? Because different people provide for different markets. There are companies which make absolutely perfectly symmetrical and everything tight and minutely brilliant tolerances. Do you want that type of sword, or do you want a sword which looks perhaps more like the medieval originals, which has got more signs of hand manufacture in it? And these are different things. So when you internally review a sword, when you judge a sword, when you decide which one to buy, have these things in mind, because you have to manage your expectations based on what you want. What you want out of the end sword will dictate which maker and which product you should go with. And don't criticize an apple for not being a banana. If you want to buy a banana, buy a banana. If you want to buy an apple, buy an apple. Don't expect one to be the other. I hope that's helpful to some of you, and I hope that illuminates some of the challenges that as a sword replicator, something that I'm doing increasingly more of actually, and will be doing more of in the future, is a real challenge. When I'm looking at a medieval object, it's like, how do I make that for the modern market while also staying true to the original? It's really way more difficult and way more challenging than you might think. Thanks a lot for watching. I'm Matt Easton, and I will continue to be. Hopefully I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks.